It is my great pleasure to be interviewing Casey Cep today, author of Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee. In addition to being a New York Times best-selling author, Ms. Cep also holds a title most of us pen pushers would give our left arm for, staff writer at the New Yorker magazine. Today, I'm going to be talking with Ms. Cep about her latest article in the magazine, Dorothy Day's Radical Faith, the Life and Legacy of the Catholic Writer and Activist, whom some hope will be made a saint. You can find the article in the New Yorker's print edition of April 13 or online at newyorker.com. First, for those who may not be familiar with the name Dorothy Day, can you tell us a little bit about the woman?
Sure. Thanks so much, Bill. I know that you and I both admire Dorothy a lot, so it's nice to have the opportunity to think about her life and to think about the ideals she held and the work she did. And the truth is, the early life of Dorothy Day probably would never have suggested the later life. And I'm sure we're going to talk about her politics, but she grew up in a slightly economically marginal family. Her father was a journalist, so you might have predicted that she would go into journalism. But, they were a fairly, bourgeois family. And the idea that they would produce a radical like Dorothy Day was unheard of. She went to college and she became a socialist, and she moved to New York and she flirted with communism, and she was a lifelong anarchist. And in her 30s, she converted to Catholicism, a conversion that led to, I think, probably what's most well known in her public work. She had been writing for a lot of periodicals, and she had written a novel, and she had produced a lot of creative work. But after that conversion, she became a social justice activist for the poor, and not only protested, not only picketed, but actually worked to create communities of solidarity where the poor were lifted up and fed, and where people like her gave up some of their wealth and privilege to live among the poor, and not just to serve them, but to live with them. So probably if folks have heard of her, they've heard of these houses of hospitality. She started a radical newspaper that identified as a faith-based newspaper. It's called the Catholic Worker. So you're right to hear the echo of the communist worker in its name, but it was full of faithful Catholicism. And some people have heard of the paper, some people might even subscribe, but I think it's those worker houses that are probably better known today. And they still exist around the US, and they still exist around the world. So maybe some of the folks listening have visited one, or they know someone who lived in one for a few years. It's not unlike the kind of missionary experience of Mormons or other faiths. Quite a lot of young Catholics spend a year or two in the Catholic Worker House and then go on to pursue some other vocation. But it's a very meaningful space and a very meaningful kind of work. And it all goes back to Dorothy, who was living in New York City and felt that someone should be doing something about the poor. And I'm sure we'll talk about it, but that deep conviction of hers, I think that seems so radical, came directly from her faith. And on reading the Gospels, it felt obvious to her that this is what Christ was calling Christians to do exactly as he did, and to live among the marginal and the despised and those who were not being looked after by the dominant society. It's quite interesting. I mean, look, obviously Gandhi's religious background is quite unlike Dorothy's, but there's a reason that she and King and Gandhi are so often linked together. And, most anarchists, most socialists, even, quite a few communists believe in, radical revolution, and they anticipate violence as a necessary way to change the social order. But I think the reason Dorothy is so often lumped in with the Reverend Martin Luther King and with Gandhi is that she was a pure pacifist too. And she was deeply committed to nonviolence. And even at her most radical moment, protesting in front of the White House, she was arrested with the Silent Sentinels protesting for women's suffrage. And she participated in a lot of anti-war activity, both during World War I and World War II and on into Vietnam. And, at all of those protests and at all of those public demonstrations, she insisted on nonviolence. And, for someone with a public pacifist ethic, she also had a personal one. And I think that's why people so often think of Gandhi and MLK. These were three of the most prominent advocates for that kind of social change. And it's interesting. I mean, look, she and King are not quite contemporaries. She's older than King was, but for me, in the kind of sphere of Christian intellectualism, of course, she has a lot in common with King. But she was pursuing these ideas right around the same time that Reinhold Niebuhr was addressing the public sphere with a version of Christianity that was just as old as Dorothy's. It goes back to Augustine, but was far more violent and far more accepting of a view of the world which required violence and war. And Reinhold Niebuhr was just as morally serious as Dorothy Day, but it was at this time that he put forward this vision of Christian realism, which said that yes, Jesus called us to be peacemakers, but sometimes the pursuit of peace might require violence, and that a just war, so long as it was anti-genocide or in pursuit of a peaceful world order, could possibly be sanctioned by the gospel. And I think in that sense, she has contemporaries. You can look at King and you can look at Gandhi, and she has intellectual equals and peers pursuing the same work. But you can begin to see just how unwelcome she was in some Christian spheres. It's on the one hand, you look at Jesus and you think, well, she's just spouting the gospel. On the other hand, there were a lot of Christian intellectuals and Christian leaders who felt that this was a very naive and very irresponsible and ultimately maybe even an unethical view of Christianity, that it abdicated responsibility for peace and the least of us. Because while Dorothy was feeding the poor, someone like Reinhold Niebuhr said he was keeping them alive in Europe. That the pursuit of war might well protect larger populations over a larger period of time. So it's a tumultuous time in Christianity, and her model was not the only one. And she was not without critics and not without people who considered her a nuisance.
In your article, we learned that in the 1910s and 1920s, Day was associated with a veritable who's who of the world's literary and revolutionary giants. Everyone from Malcolm Cowley to Leon Trotsky. Could you tell us a little bit about her relationship with the playwright Eugene O'Neill?
When I get to write pieces like this, I've always admired Dorothy Day, and I thought I knew something about her. This piece is basically a review of a new biography and a new documentary, both of which lift up this period of her life that was pure cosmopolitanism. And I thought I knew Dorothy Day, and you start reading things like, oh, she had a relationship with Eugene O'Neill, and you think, wait, what? I never knew that. And, the short account of Dorothy Day's kind of 20s and 30s is that she was lucky enough to live in New York City. And if you lived in New York City, you just crossed paths with these kinds of people. And, she interviewed Leon Trotsky. We said she was working as a journalist, and she got this assignment to go interview him. And you think, well, did that carry her all the way to Russia? And then you realize Trotsky was living in the Bronx. And she was dating Eugene O'Neill, who was living in the Village. And for a while, she was roommates with a woman who would go on to marry the poet Alan Tate. And, it's just the mix of New York. And I've never lived there, but it's just my sense that, it's one of the largest cities in the country, but just this incredibly small world of intellectuals and writers. And so it's quite fun to look at her life, and she's a little ping pong ball going around these circles and trying to get to know people. And it's quite an aspirational time in her life. I mean, she really did want to be as famous as Eugene O'Neill. They were dating, his plays were already doing well. She knew people who were having books published, and there's quite a lot of striving. And it's just an interesting period, and she's so human. And some might say she was making a lot of mistakes. She was not only talking about ideas in bars, she was also imbibing in bars. And so there's just this period of her life where she's kind of freewheeling and busy, and she's involved in disastrous relationships, and she's trying to figure out where to live and who to live with and whether she'll ever get married. And quite a lot of it was fun, but this is also, I think, one of the great moral crises of her life. It's in this period that she's dating someone else. He's not as famous as Eugene O'Neill. The name would mean nothing today, but he was dating a writer, and kind of a heartthrob, like a Hemingway and an agey type. And she's dating this man, and she gets pregnant, and he convinces her to have an abortion. He's actually quite insistent about it. And she's not yet a Catholic, um, but she finds the decision very torturous. And also, it's at a time abortion is not legal, and it's extremely difficult and imperiling to pursue one. And it's a home abortion. She experiences a lot of pain. And so this period of her life is really this sort of fun roller coaster, but also real low points and real uncertainty about, the kind of life she'll build. Will she always live alone? Will she be a solitary intellectual? Will she marry, someone more famous than she is and be subservient to them, which was the fate of a lot of women at this time. I mentioned Alan Tate's wife, but most of us know Alan Tate and we don't know Caroline Gordon. So it's really a period of uncertainty for her. But it must be said that, if your period of uncertainty and your period of kind of wayward youth includes dating Eugene O'Neill, things aren't going that badly for you. I think the other side of that for us, of course, is just to realize, Dorothy was not a meek, fainting Christian woman. She was a powerhouse and a bombshell, and someone wanted to spend their time with. So I think in moments like this, when you're reading a biography, it's of course important to realize you're not just learning about the person's social circle, you're learning about their personality and the charisma that they brought to any community. And I think in that sense, it's very easy these days to underestimate Dorothy and to think of her as just a certain kind of religious person. But when you look at this period of her life, you realize she was, bawdy and raw and, charismatic and someone who could really just hold a room. So that's why I like that period too. But again, it's wildly fascinating to watch all these people who she intersects with.
And then everything seems to change when she has a child out of wedlock. Shortly thereafter, she happens upon a nun on the street, asks her to help her have her child baptized, and ends up converting to Catholicism. It is then that she meets the man you call her life's soulmate, the philosopher, poet, Peter Maurin. I'm afraid I'd never heard of Maurin. Would you tell us a little bit about him?
I mean, I love this part of her life because it's true that her romantic life went one way and her religious calling took her another. And, Peter Maurin is this kind of, interesting halfway figure between the two. And Gary Wills wrote a profile of Dorothy Day right after she died. And he says that Maurin was basically, passed along to Dorothy by some other Catholic intellectuals who couldn't put up with him anymore. And, Maurin was born, he was one of 24 children. He was born into a, Parisian peasant family. And whatever fate he thought he might have found in the world, he became a kind of itinerant thinker. And, I jokingly call him a troubadour because you're right, he wrote a lot of poetry. He was very interested in language, but he was also incredibly philosophical. And he lived a kind of mendicant life. He went around, talking to people about ideas and debating philosophies and trying to come up with a way to live that was intellectually and morally satisfying to him. And when he met Dorothy, one of the things he was interested in was starting a newspaper because he felt that the tradition and the patience of several generations before, for debate and for intellectual discourse had fallen out. And what he wanted to do was start a newspaper which would generate these kinds of conversations and which would spark, reflection and dissent among the faithful. And so he came to Dorothy because he knew she had worked as a journalist, but she, of course, you're not a minority build to have never heard of him. She certainly hadn't, and most people in New York hadn't. He was just a very poor, disheveled-looking man. In fact, later in life, when they were working together on the Catholic Worker, and she and Peter would go and they would give speeches and they would basically go and talk about the work so that people might donate. When Peter went around, sometimes people didn't know he was the speaker and they thought he was just a bum panhandling because he looked so disheveled, and they did not think, oh, this was the esteemed man who had started this incredible social movement. And so they actually co-founded the Catholic Worker together. But Dorothy both lived longer and I think in the end became a more public face for the institution. So that's why we think of her. And she was American, and again, in the Catholic tradition, I think to some extent, the gender disparity in some of the leadership roles mean that a woman like Dorothy Day is a very welcome witness, because she managed, even though she was a lay person, to do an extraordinary amount in the church. And I think that's probably why has fallen out of favor a little. But he's tremendously interesting, and when you go and you look at the older issues of the Catholic Worker when they first got started, he's contributing a lot of material, and he's writing a lot of what he called easy essays, and they're these kind of prose poems, like, they're just tremendous fun. And he played with language, he played with ideas, and as much as we associate all of this work with Dorothy Day, she might never have started it if she hadn't crossed paths with him. So it's nice, it's nice to get to think about his life. And this new biography has a fair amount of information about his background and how he arrived in the U.S. and what he went on to do. He doesn't get as much in the documentary that I think the library is going to share with their patrons too. But it's a beautiful documentary. It looks at her intellectual life, which of course owes something to Peter. But yes, he's a strange figure, and it's almost by necessity that he's French, because there aren't really people like that in America. He would have been disparaged for not having a job and not doing more work. But I love when Dorothy met him, she didn't kick him out. She didn't say, go and find someone else to bother. She just listened. And it turned out that this act of listening changed her life, and changed New York, and changed Philadelphia, and changed St. Louis, and changed all the places that the Catholic Worker would go. And it came from tremendous patience and interest in other people. And that's actually one of Peter's chief philosophical ideas. We've all heard of communism and socialism and anarchism, but Peter was a personalist, which is a philosophy that's not much endured, but essentially it comes down to this idea that the unit of ethical change is the individual person, and that the alteration of your personhood through experience and engagement is somehow what leads to a radical intellectual and philosophical change. And I think that, Dorothy, who had been ping-ponging around the Greenwich Village scene and who had been imbibing, the ideas of the communist worker and thinking about the radical left, it was such a gift to meet someone like Peter, who said that actually society is one unit of change, but individual people is another unit too, and a meaningful one. And so in that sense, it was very perfect, because it liberated her from having to change all of America at once, and being able to change the lives and the minds and the hearts of individual New Yorkers, or individual Minnesotans when she went out there to fundraise. And I think in that sense, it really was essential that she meet him.
Sure. So at least from our modern perspective, Dorothy Day was a walking contradiction, a revolutionary who managed to remain pretty radical while simultaneously submitting herself body and soul to the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, an institution known for its strict adherence to doctrine. Did Day herself find this perplexing?
And we're really lucky Dorothy Day not only spoke quite frequently, but she was a prolific letter writer, and she wrote 2 autobiographies. So we have access to quite a lot of her interior intellectual life. And it's remarkable to me when you go and you read it, those tensions and those paradoxes are external and not internal. It's quite remarkable the degree to which she just assented to the church and to the authority, the apostolic authority of the church, and was not querulous with it. I mean, she had meaningful exterior disagreements with the church. There's a really remarkable moment where there are some grave diggers who were employed by the diocese who were picketing, and she, joins in this protest of the Archdiocese of New York. And she's tremendously public in some of her disagreements, and she felt that the church wasn't doing enough for the poor. But those quarrels were always with the instantiation of the church now, not the church eternal, and not the dogma, and not the orthodox beliefs. And it's quite, actually, it was a gift for someone like me who expected much more inner turmoil and uncertainty and angst in some sense. And she had a kind of existential angst about the world. one of the most beautiful things she wrote, her second memoir was called The Long Loneliness. And it was about the way in which the soul can pursue God or be pursued by God in this lifetime. So she wasn't without it, but it's just really, it's not to the extent that you might expect it from someone who had such a radical conversion,
Sure.
and someone who was not a cradle Catholic. She wasn't even a cradle Christian. She demanded to be baptized in the Episcopal Church when she was 12 years old. Her parents were not churchgoers. Her father identified as an atheist. And so she had this innate religiosity that then at 30 years old found its natural home in the Catholic Church. So I think it's a wonderful question. And I think that I don't know about you, but it comes from experience for me of wanting to understand how people reconcile these tensions and find their way through contradictions. And there was some of that in her life. Again, she had questions about doctrine, and she expressed her dissatisfaction, her kind of impatience with the church to catch up to the teachings of Christ. But there's also just a remarkable degree of peace that she found in her faith. And so much of that conflict, I think, is what we all bring to her life. And what we, even at the time, outsiders looked at her and just assumed there ought to be more conflict. And, I don't want to make it sound all palatable, because of course some of what you and I are interested in is her hypocrisy. And in that sense, maybe she was too at ease with the doctrines and the way that they interacted with her own life. The most straightforward of which is she had tremendous empathy for women who needed to make choices about their reproductive life and health. But she assented to the church's view of abortion, even though she had one that some might say saved her life. That if it weren't for that, she might have lived a very different life. She wouldn't have met Peter. She might never have become a Catholic. And yet she then assented to a view. And she had been, pro birth control, and she had been part of the kind of feminist revolution early days. The French Simone de Beauvoir, these people kind of ahead of the American mainstream feminist movement. But here she was in later life just saying, no, abortion is morally abhorrent. And, those are tensions that I think other people sort of look at it and think, well, maybe she ought to have been more troubled. But again, we're lucky we can go and read her work and see for ourselves what she thought and how she reconciled some of these different positions.
People today will find it hard to believe that Dorothy Day counseled pacifism during World War II. After the revelations about the atrocities committed by the Axis in Europe and Asia, did Day change her mind about that?
Yeah, that's another great question. And I think that's probably, that comes out of what we were just discussing, the degree to which she was bothered by her own beliefs or troubled by her own consistency. And I think it's interesting because her position on World War II, is really dichotomous with the later position she would take on the Cuban Revolution. So she was anti-World War II, but pro-Cuban Revolution. And I think that she lived long enough, I hope, to see that she was wrong on both counts. And, you're right to lift up the outcome of World War II, which was to end the vast atrocities, the genocide against the Jews, the near obliteration of European Judaism, a beautiful faith older than Christianity, and one which had lifted up communities around Europe that was under extermination threat. And Dorothy, from the safety of the United States, told men to take down their flags and to resist the draft. And, she was not just someone who said, oh, I don't want to fight. She was not just someone who asserted the right of conscientious objectors. She disapproved of the war and protested and fought to keep America out and fought to get America out. And, I think that she must have been very humbled by what came out of Birkenau and Auschwitz and these places of pure evil and horror. And, I think that, again, she was advocating those views at the same time Reinhold Niebuhr was saying Christians have a real responsibility to protect the vulnerable and the oppressed. And there is the necessity sometimes for violent protection of these people, because otherwise mass violence will exterminate them. And, so I think that her pacifism, while beautifully simplistic and, beautifully consistent until the Cuban Revolution, was nonetheless what some people would say a foolish consistency, because of course it is possible to draw a moral distinction between different kinds of war. Again, going back to Augustine, plenty of other Catholics had done this. And there's real disagreement. There's Stanley Hauerwas, who's a pacifist like she is, and there's someone like Nigel Bigger today who, still advocates for just war. There are good, morally serious Christians on every side of this issue. And there was Dorothy insisting that it was all so easy and that we just needed to withdraw and be peaceful, which requires the consent of those not being peaceful already. And it's not clear how she would have negotiated with Hitler or how well those negotiations would have gone. But I think that's an example of, it's one thing to just sort of nod your head at Dorothy and say it's all so easy to admire. She's such a good Christian woman. People were outraged. And, for good reasons, Catholics were worried about being seen as seditious. They were worried about being seen as unpatriotic. And on the other side of the war, they were worried about being seen as, morally absent, which in fact, the Roman Catholic Church has been much criticized for. That there was a lot more the church in Europe could have been doing, that churches in America and Britain and in other parts of the Western world were actively decrying these war crimes and trying to get more refugees out of the Third Reich and trying to do more to stabilize the world order. So it's a perfectly fine example of the sort of thing. I don't presume to know what was right, and I understand very sincerely all of the intellectual convictions that brought Dorothy to that position. But it's certainly an example, to your point, of today where you would really scratch your head at it, and probably some people who had grandfathers or fathers who fought to liberate Europe who would just scoff at her. Say, what an unserious position and what an untenable one. So it's a very fine example of how I think Dorothy is a good example of someone who should be admired, but not uncritically. That we should look at the moments where her judgment lapsed. And probably the best example of that for me is in her she had utter contempt for government welfare. And that's one where, that's really a hard one for me too, where I just think there's systemic inequality in this country and around the world. And so far, that kind of welfare and support system is one of the best mechanisms we've found to address it without bias or prejudice in a universal way. And that's one where it's just very hard for me to understand why an advocate of the poor would be so disdainful of one of the most effective ways of combating poverty. And I know all the intellectual reasons she despised the state and did not want the state to be a mechanism of welfare. But on the other side of it, it's hard to argue with a program like Social Security, and harder still to argue with WIC and SNAP. Even in times of, moral bounty or material bounty in this country, much less today. I just think it's an impossible burden for private soup kitchens to meet at this moment. There's so much need in this country, but, that was Dorothy, difficult on all sides, managed. I think the biographers say she kind of managed to offend everyone in some way, that just when you thought you admired her, uncritically and universally, you learn some other opinion of hers and you realize, yes, that is, repugnant to me, or just seems naive or intellectually dishonest. And so she really did just sort of manage to look around the room and find a way to to delight everyone, but to offend or challenge them too.
When I hear the word anarchist, I think of people like Sacco and Vanzetti, early 20th century bomb throwers. What did the term mean to Dorothy Day, and how did it apply to her?
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Bill, to lift up. This was the age of Sacco and Vanzetti. It was the age of the Haymarket bombing. This was the time and place where anarchists were actively engaged in violence, supposedly, around the country and around the world. I think that today there might be a pejorative sense of anarchists as, unhappy, moody teenagers or something, and they wear black and they have pentagrams on their clothes. But this was a time of true political anarchism, and people were taking the Unabomber, people were taking radical action to undermine the state. And here was Dorothy Day, self-identifying with that movement. And I think that, look, at its core, anarchism is just, it's anti the state, it's anti-leadership. It disapproves of any involuntary, organization. And the nation state is kind of the consummate example of that. If you are born into this country, you are an American, whether you desire to be or not. You know, it is your citizenship, it is ascribed to you. You are expected to pay taxes and participate in a society, whether or not you assent. And Dorothy thought that that was abhorrent. And, you know, she believed only in voluntary associations. And the truth is, she never paid taxes, for instance. You know, we were talking about what she had in common with MLK and Gandhi. And to some extent, you know, because she was, you know, a nice Catholic woman who was white as opposed to king, she was allowed to get away with things like the IRS never imprisoning her for back taxes. Or, you know, they threatened to take her to court at one point, and they did try and investigate the Catholic worker. But, you know, she was an anarchist through and through. And originally she was a, you know, anarchist of the communist stripe. And then she became, you know, what she called a Christian anarchist. And these people exist. They're Christian socialists, Christian anarchists, but it meant simply that she did not believe in the involuntary associations we would have with the state. And that the state, moreover, was not always the best or even the appropriate organizer of society. And that's why, right, so welfare was best administered by local voluntary associations, like the Catholic worker, or, you know, the Lutheran Church, or the Episcopal Church, or, you know, the Reformed Synagogue. Those institutions, or, you know, the Atheists United, those voluntary associations would provide for the collective good. And the state, you know, had its role, but it was not that. And if you didn't want to participate in the state, you shouldn't be forced to. So that's the core of her anarchism. But yes, it does lead to the supposed, you know, I think Sacco and Vanzetti are ultimately a bad example because they've been vindicated by, you know, ongoing investigations and reconsiderations of their case. And so much of what happened to them was xenophobia against Italian immigrants. But, you know, there were certainly other examples of anarchists who were committing acts of violence in pursuit of their political ideology. And Dorothy never did that. You know, again, she insisted on nonviolence. But yes, she, you know, chose to identify as an anarchist. She was not a patriot. She would never have worn an American flag. She protested, you know, all of the, you know, peace drills that came about during, you know, the Cold War when we were supposed to be exercising preparedness for a nuclear holocaust. Dorothy was out picketing in Central Park saying, you know, no American should be forced to do this. It's an invasion of, you know, privacy and self-determination by the state. And, you know, she was calling the New York Times to make sure that they made it on the front of the paper, you know, asserting that the state had overreached and overstepped. And, you know, she sounds somewhat like a libertarian. It's hard to know. I mean, I guess she believed in public health, but it's actually quite possible for me to imagine Dorothy picketing, you know, social distancing guidelines today, because how dare the state, you know, tell us we can't go to mass, and even if it's for our own protection, which I'm laughing and I see you laughing too, but of course plenty of people are out doing that today. She wouldn't have been alone. She might have been, you know, the only anarchist doing it, and the folks around her with their American flag or their Confederate flags might have, you know, turned up their nose when they realized she identified that way. But, you know, again, this is why no one loves her wholly. I mean, God loves her wholly, but I don't think today that there are many of us who would assent to all of her beliefs or all of her political positions, including anarchism.
Trying to imagine what Dorothy Day would say if she knew people were talking about making her a saint, you wrote, and I quote, "Even before the coronavirus devastated our economy and added millions to the unemployment rolls, 500,000 Americans were homeless, 27 million lacked health insurance, 38 million lived in poverty, and 40 million relied on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which the current administration is trying to cut. In the face of this, one suspects that Day would insist that no one is the rightful owner of her legacy because, as yet, no one has fulfilled it. Stop talking about me, she'd almost certainly say, and start talking about the poor," end quote. What do you think Dorothy Day would recommend as the proper response today to the ills you have enumerated, all those millions of disadvantaged Americans?
So, first of all, she did address the issue of sainthood in her lifetime. You know, people early in her life brought as soon as she became a Catholic, who was such a role model for other Catholics. You know, again, these young charismatic Catholics who had never seen someone embody the gospel. You know, we're generations away from the social gospel when, you know, she lived until 1980. And, you know, at a time where most Catholics, many Catholics, I shouldn't say most, but many Catholics lived their faith privately and did not perform public acts of charity. Here was Dorothy Day bringing in the homeless and sitting down to eat with them and surrendering her life to their care. And, you know, it was an incredibly compelling witness to a lot of people, and they came to be part of it, and they were inspired by it, and they went and started their own communes and collective living organizations. And, you know, they agreed with her that the numbers you've just revealed, and look, they've always been bad. There's never been a moment where America wasn't riddled with poverty. You know, in Appalachia, in parts of the rural South, you know, in our cities, there's never been a moment where we have actually lived up to our moral responsibility to the poorest Americans. And so at every moment when these people looked around, you know, it was too large a problem to solve for any one person, including Dorothy. So if you lived in Los Angeles, you could never fix poverty in New York. You could never fix it in rural Alabama, but you could maybe fix it in your neighborhood. And I think that one of the reasons Dorothy continues to inspire is she said, be aware of the poverty around the world, but fix it on your block, fix it in your neighborhood, fix it in your own heart, make yourself open to the experiences of other people. And it's a lot more manageable, a moral responsibility. And it feels, you know, again, that personalist model of if you can help one person out of poverty, if you can help two, if you can help build the shelter that brings out 10, that every one of those lives that change, including yours, is meaningful. And in a way, whether or not it ever fixes the systemic problem of poverty, it changes the world. And, you know, that was the Dorothy model. It was not, let's go lobby Congress and try to, you know, get those 37 million people their health insurance or those 40 million people more SNAP benefits. It was, let's go and find one person in need and meet their needs, whatever they are. And I think that, you know, again, that was so inspiring to so many people. And they started to talk about her as a saint right away. You know, she was subjected to that moniker for much of her life, and eventually got sort of allergic to it and said, you know, I know what you're trying to do here. And if you make me a saint, you make me palatable. You know, you eliminate all of the frictions and the abrasiveness of my beliefs. And she was very disapproving. You know, again, she went to blows with the Catholic Church many times. You know, she was mad, you know, how dare you, she would say things like, how dare you have, you know, a beautiful rectory and not house the poor in it? You know, and today I think she would have said, you know, how dare you build new churches when you declare bankruptcy to avoid paying the victims of the sex abuse scandal? You know, how dare you shield the material wealth of the church and deny it to the poor who Christ came to serve? And I think she felt that if she were made a saint, all of those contradictions would be smoothed over. And that people would just sort of nod and say, oh, yes, she fed the poor. And not, oh, yes, she disapproved of World War II. Or, oh, yes, you know, she fed the poor, but she actually disapproved of government welfare. You know, that if you called her a saint, it would allow you to look only at the aspects of her life and personality which were inoffensive. And I think that that's why she was so disapproving in her lifetime. And it's so funny. A lot of the most, I mean, there are many objections to making her a saint. You know, there are the conservative objections of this is a woman who had a child out of wedlock, who was maybe not the best mother, who had an abortion, who lived a very, you know, debaucherous life in her 20s, and who was disrespectful of the Catholic Church. But then there are the liberal objections, plenty of Catholic workers who just say, you know, if you make her a saint, she's lost all of her radicalness. And her own family hasn't allowed the church to exhume her body, which is supposed to be one of the stages to sainthood. This investigation is quite thorough, and her grandchildren have said no. You know, no, you may not have her. You know, she was a faithful Catholic, but she was not submissive to the church authority, and we will continue to keep her from you. So it's a very contentious debate over, you know, will the process even move forward? And I think that, you know, really for me, she's such an interesting figure because part of what is so compelling is every moment you think you understand her, or every moment you think that you espouse the same views, you learn something else, and she's, not repugnant, but just hard to live with. She is really like your, best friend who you love to argue with and who ultimately you just cherish and want to hold close, but who also drives you bonkers. She's like a spouse for some people. The very
Sure.
moment you think you understand them, they advocate some completely odd or offensive view to you. And I think that that's really the delight of sitting down with her life, is to realize the things you have in common and the things you don't, and why she held the position she did. And, I think probably another example I love of this is I tell the story in the piece of how one of her admirers was W.H. Auden, the poet. And Auden at one point learned that the Catholic worker had been fined by the city of New York. And you think, well, how capricious, how dare they fine them? And, Dorothy was upset because the city said that the building was not up to fire code. And she thought it was this capricious application of, building safety rules, which of course, on the other side of things, if the Catholic worker had burned down and 30 homeless people had died in the fire, Dorothy Day would not have been admired. She would have been despised. And so you think, well, I have sympathy with the building code inspector who said, you don't have sprinklers. This is a hazard to the people who live here. And here was Dorothy saying, no, I'm an anarchist. I don't submit to building codes, which, as far as tyranny goes, building codes are one of those things that I think, thank God we have them. I want to be safe when I stay somewhere. And the homeless don't deserve any less protection than anyone else. And so Auden paid this fine for her so they could upgrade the building and, meet the code. But that's a moment where, Dorothy's self-righteousness is offensive to me because, again, there was no fire, people were safe, but you imagine the version of life where there was, and the legacy of the worker was endangered. And that's just what happened. She participated in all these anti-Vietnam protests, but one of the men who self-immolated in front of the embassy was a Catholic worker. And, she was a friend and correspondent of Thomas Merton, and Merton was very disapproving. And he felt that she had whipped these young men into a kind of moral frenzy, and that, ultimately she had encouraged this. And so again, you may agree with her pacifism and you may think the war in Vietnam was morally abhorrent, but you probably don't agree with, that act of suicide. And you would not support the person who had encouraged your brother or your nephew or your son to protest the war in such a self-harming way. So again, I just think it's wonderful to sit with a life like this, because you find these moments and you find these episodes which do make her more complicated than just a saint, just a uniformly admirable person. She was not Christ. And even Christ, if you're the Syro-Phoenician woman, had moments where you look at his character and think, I might have treated this person differently. So certainly Dorothy would have said, if you decide that you agree with everything and that nothing I did was offensive or challenging to you, then I have been failed. And I don't want that label. And I do not want to be smoothed over and weakened and lessened in this way. So it's complicated. And, I think it'll be interesting to see how the process plays out. There are other female American saints. She wouldn't be the first. But, she's advanced in the process. Her cause of sainthood was opened in the year 2000. This biography and this documentary kind of are meant to encourage that process and allow people to think about her life and legacy. And as it unfolds, more American Catholics are meant to be aware of her witness and to pray for her interventions, because ultimately sainthood isn't just about your life. It's the question of miracles. And people joke that Dorothy's first miracle was nobody who went to her funeral had a hangover after. But at some point, the church hierarchy will be scrutinizing her life and posthumous life for miracles. So these public, the biography, the documentary, these ways of letting the public get to know her life are an effort to encourage people, to pray for healings through her character and through her personhood, so that maybe miracles would be identified and the church could move on in the sainthood process. But it's a wonderful, wonderful occasion to think about her life and to take it seriously and to look at it in its fullness and not, just read the storybook version.
If she was a saint, she certainly was a very human saint. But that's kind of what sainthood is all about. And the final analysis. But
Yeah, I appreciate it. I know, Bill, you had emailed me that language, and I think that you're right. And I'm so curious. I know that you were already aware of Dorothy and were interested in her life. And, I wonder, is she among your saints when you think about your life and how you want to live it, or is she someone you've always had a kind of quarrel with?
no, I've always admired her. To be quite honest, I learned so much more about her though from reading your article, and now I want to read a book. Are you ever going to write a biography yourself of
It's a great question. I mean, this biography is very interesting. I mentioned in the piece, I mean, there are two others that might be more interesting to people depending on the kinds of ways they like to learn about people's lives. And, look, the Cliff Notes version is this beautiful documentary that you can go online and stream, if you're trapped in your home or you're obeying the social distancing guidelines. You don't have to go anywhere. You can just stream the film. The biography I'm reviewing is a kind of doorstop biography. You're going to learn the life of every lesser intellectual figure in Greenwich Village, and that's one way to learn about someone's life. It might be too much for a lot of people. So I mentioned these two other biographies, and one is written by one of Dorothy's granddaughters, and that's a very beautiful book. And it's a little more like memoir. You get all the highlights of her life, but you learn more. Dorothy was a complicated person even in her personal life, and the daughter she had out of wedlock lived with her in most of these Catholic worker houses, and it was a precarious place for the child. And the care and love she provided for her daughter and her daughter's complicated home life is the subject of that granddaughter's book, and it's a very beautiful look at her grandmother. And the other book I mentioned is by this writer Robert Coles. And Robert's book is a much more psychological portrait of Dorothy. It's shorter. You get all the basics of her life, but you also get an intellectual argument about why she was the way she was. And I've taken all of her philosophy quite seriously, as does Dr. Coles, but he asserts something about her that I think is probably true, which is, her life was not guided entirely by philosophy. It was guided also by emotion. And so if you make sense of some of her contradictions in the sense that, she had an epiphanic conversion, she lived her life with these brief moments of revelation and inspiration. And so overall, she was not about consistency. She was not about logic. She was about emotion and what the spirit was calling her to do. And I think in that way, it's a very sophisticated biography because it makes a much more coherent claim about why she believed the things she did and acted the way she did. So it's kind of a choose your own adventure. I really like Dr. Cole's biography a lot, and it has the virtue of brevity. But if you want something more personal, her granddaughter's book is quite good. And, but if you're signing up for, you've got a lot of time over the next few weeks and you just want every possible detail of her life, this new biography is called Dissenting Voice of the American Century. It's a beautiful book, and it's interesting. It's a lot of detail is my only word of caution. So you can choose, one of those, and every reader will be different, but they're all absolutely wonderful ways of learning more about her and thinking more about her. And, for me, it was really just encouraging. She was, whether or not she was a saint, she was the witness I needed for these weeks ahead. And she certainly made me want to be more generous and made me want to be more patient and made me want to be more open. And, I went yesterday, I was covering, I wasn't volunteering, one of the food bank events, one of the distribution events at Chapel District Elementary. And, if you think you have to go to New York City to find hungry people or people who need assistance, you need to look outside your door and you need to walk around Easton and you need to think about, people in Whitman and people in Cordova and people, on the edges of St. Michael's. It's here in Talbot County. I actually live in Caroline now, but it's on the shore and it's real and it's immediate and it's only getting worse. And I hope that if you think about someone like Dorothy, she makes you look around your own life for things you could be doing, not just money, but time. And, I think in a really beautiful way, even if you're experiencing financial hardship, it is about emotion and about the ways we treat each other. And even if you can't donate $500 to the food bank, you can be loving and kind and give of your time and spirit to people who are in need and who are scared and who might be going through this for the first time. But I just think, she's really, whether or not she was a saint, she's exactly the kind of person I think we should be thinking about today, because she can help us really look around the world differently. And that's, whether or not you're a Christian, I just think she is an ethical figure of interest, whatever your religious persuasion.
Yeah, I agree.
I agree.
And it's possible that people are going to consider you for sainthood one of these days. That was really
Absolutely not. I mean, my goodness, I think Dorothy might be, I think she's an incredibly interesting person. I would like to think that I am generous with my time and my money, but one of the nice things about people like Dorothy Day is you are morally convicted no matter who you are, no matter how well you have lived your life, no matter how generous you are. It is so easy to look up and think you are more generous than those people, but you look down and you just realize she was truly radical. And it's, at least for me, I feel convicted, and I think that so often it's easy to intellectualize problems and to get caught up in the best possible solution. And for me personally, Dorothy's life is such a fine example, because when she didn't know what to think, she knew what to do.
sure.
And it's a really important reminder that, sitting with people in need, even if you don't know the structural way to fix it, and even if you don't have enough money to solve it, is its own gift. And I think that, we can get caught up in, well, was Christ a pacifist or not? And, is Christian realism more defensible than Christian existentialism? And, is communism better than socialism? And, that's all well and good, and it's important work, and I love it, and I think that God calls many of us to intellectual work. But Jesus came to sit with the despised and to feed the hungry. And Dorothy just said over and over again, her radicalness was that of Christ. And it is easy to protect yourself with intellectual argument and harder to go and do this work. And so, no, it's very clear to me I'm not a saint when I look at someone like Dorothy, and that I can be doing more, and that there is more to do. So again, I just think it's a really wonderful moment to be thinking about her, and to try and live up to the example she set. And if you are a Christian, to go back and look at the Gospels and where she got her beliefs, because she didn't get them by reading Russian philosophy. She got them by reading the Gospels. And over and over again, I think that she was right to point to Christ as the inspiration for her work.
Casey Cep, thank you so much for being the gifted, generous, wise person you are. And thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us today. I'm sure I speak for all of Talbot County and all of the Eastern Shore when I beg you, please do not ever stop writing.
That's very sweet. And Bill, I'd be remiss if I didn't say thanks to you for your work with the library. And